America's Global Role After Bush, a 53-minute presentation held in the Montgomery Lecture Theatre at the Joint Services Command and Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 31st of January 2007. The speaker is Professor Bruce Jentleson, Senior Visiting Research Fellow in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University. Professor Bruce Jentleson.
A lot of the work I do deals with various aspects of American foreign policy. I've spent some time in government as well. I worked in the previous administration, both on the State Department policy planning staff and as a senior advisor to the former Vice President, Al Gore. And I've also worked on a lot of projects that bring the academic and the policy communities together. And I think that now we're at a point in time in which it's important to start. We should, hopefully be well on our way to thinking about many of these issues, about where American foreign policy is going to go. The one thing we know for sure is that there will be an after Bush. We don't know much more about that. Among the many consequences of Iraq, though, is that it's hard to get beyond Iraq itself and more fully take up this topic of America's global role. The dominance of the agenda by Iraq, for obvious reasons. And I think also it's fair to say the anger and antipathy towards the United States in many parts of the world is documented by one opinion study after another, the Pew Global Attitudes projects. And the trends that are being picked up are not just what I sort of call knee-jerk anti-Americanism. I actually come from New York, and any of you are familiar with the American pastime of baseball. The New York Yankees had always been the great team when I was growing up. And when you met people from other parts of the United States, they resented you from New York because we'd been number one for so long. And so there's a certain amount of resentment that comes, whether it's in baseball, football, or globally, from being number one. But I think it goes much beyond that. We can debate whether it's fair or not, but this anger and antipathy is something the United States has to deal with. I think in some respects the ultimate failure of leadership in any walk of life is not so much when others don't think they need your leadership, but it's when they do and you disappoint them. And it's not just you don't help make things better, but there's a certain sense that you make things worse. And so as we look forward, I think we know what the solution is not. I don't believe it's more of what I would call the Bushian conception of American power and role. I also don't think it's American retreat. I would argue that most aspects of international peace and security and justice are more likely to be achieved if the United States is playing a significant and a constructive role. And so the question that I want to address in the time that we have is the question of how can the United States use its power and position in ways that are both in our own national interest and in the global interest. And I want to do this in a way very conscious of time, because I'd actually like to leave a good chunk of time for discussion and questions. That's really about what I would call guiding concepts, frameworks for thinking about the way the world is changing, for setting priorities and overarching strategies, with a few policy specifics, but I don't want to go through a laundry list of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Iran, et cetera, et cetera. They'll come in, but it's more important to get at some of the broad ways to think about the world. One of the tricky parts here, in terms of defining the U.S. role and position, is how we talk about it. We know we are not the leader of the world. And as I'll say in a moment, that's for reasons that are not just about what has happened in the last 6 years, but ways in which the world has fundamentally changed. But I think it's also fair to say the United States is not just another major power. The world is not unipolar, but it's also not multipolar. And I've been wrestling with the concept, the metaphor, the word, the historical example, the analogy, to describe what this leadership is in a ways that communicates not only to an audience like this, a policy and academic audience, but even to people politically. So any ideas that people have on this, I'm more than welcome. So the structure of the talk really has three parts. Some brief comments about what I think the Bush legacy is. A second part on what I call the global strategic challenges, which are not about the United States per se, but really are about the forces shaping the world for all of us as we deal with it. And third, for the U.S. role itself. Now, my dilemma is, anytime one's writing a book on these things, this is really three talks in one. And so I'm going to ask your forbearance in a couple of respects. One is I'm going to skip over some points that are in here that are interesting. If you want to come back to them, we can. Even though there'll be slides, I'm just going to skip over them to try to use the time the best we can. Secondly, I will kind of throw some points out there and not fully develop them, and you can challenge me on that. We can go back to that. And third is I'm not going to talk about Iraq. I'd be happy to talk about Iraq in the Q&A, but I think that it's hard to just talk about Iraq for 30 seconds. But it'll come in by implication in a lot of things what I say, and if you want to spend more time on it, that's one of the ways that we'll use the question period. I would describe the Bush legacy The overall legacy of the Bush foreign policy, in my view, is nothing less than the squandering of America's global position. It's discrediting abroad and it's undermining at home. That has three key aspects. One is what I call the gap between power and influence, or if we're going to be historical about it, the gap, the Thucydidean fallacy. Second is the gap between power and authority. And third would be Iraq. Let me talk about the first two of these particularly. There's this old expression from Thucydides that many of you have probably read, that the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. If this were true, then the United States really would have had very little to worry about in its foreign policy. We spend more on the military than the next 15 nations combined. The American economy still accounts for over 30% of world GDP. Our seat is at the head of most every diplomatic table. And ours is the world's oldest democracy. We still even hear proclamations of America's Goliath, or as Joseph Jaffe, the German journalist, said, as an uber power. But the fundamental flaw in this dictum from Thucydides is that there is a gap between power and influence. There are three ways of thinking about power. One is as resources. Who has the most resources to bring to bear? And clearly, as some of the indicators I talked about, the United States registers high on that. But there are two other aspects of power. One is your ability to control others, to get them to do what you want them to do. Countries, nations, non-state actors. And the other is to control outcomes, to make sure you get the outcomes that you want. The assumption that comes from Thucydides that you can convert that first kind of power, control over resources, to the other two, is one of the things I think we see in a lot of international affairs that is flawed. The weak don't always roll over or fall into line, and the strong are not always strong enough to achieve their objectives on their own or on their own terms. That even a state as preponderantly powerful as the United States is today has found out the hard way that our crucial foreign policy challenges are less about doing what we want to do than about getting others to do what we want them to do and ensuring that outcomes are what we want them to be. States balance against us, bargain with us, oppose us, even bandwagon against us. This may be because of our very preponderance of power. It may be in spite of it. But either way, the bottom line is that the possession of power does not guarantee the successful exercise of influence. That there is a gap between power's resources and the capacity to have influence. And there are two aspects of this. One is what I call the structural systemic part, which really, in many ways, flows from the end of the Cold War, which, frankly, has very little to do with George Bush and the Bush administration. If Al Gore won the election, those factors would still be at work in changing the world that have changed, in many respects, the nature of power. The second part, I think, are the parts that are attributable to the Bush foreign policy, and ways in which even before 9/11 and even before Iraq, there were some very substantial antagonisms that were built up in terms of the unilateral approach on a whole variety of issues. As The Economist editorialized in 2002, has George Bush ever met a treaty that he liked? It's hard to avoid the suspicion that the very idea of multilateral cooperation that Bush opposes. The other part of this power influence gap is the devaluation and wasteful expenditure of a major currency of American power, which is our military superiority. By wasteful expenditure, I refer to Iraq and accounts Tom Ricks' book Fiasco and many others in which we have, I think, spent an extraordinary amount of our military resources measured any number of ways, budget dollars, equipment, casualties, morale, in ways that I would argue have not made us or anybody else more secure. The second part, I think, is what I call devaluation of the currency. And I'll come back to this in a second, which is the limited utility of military superiority in contemporary warfare. Things that people like General Sir Rupert Smith have written about and others. And the rising value of other currencies as well. All of this is part of that power influence gap. The power authority gap is in contrast to the Cold War, where I think, in broad terms, there was a sense that the United States not only had the power, but many countries and people in the world, in the non-communist world, really had this sense that the U.S. not only had power, it had the authority to speak for them, to act for them. There were disputes, many of them between us and our allies here in Europe and elsewhere, but fundamentally, you can see the contrast between a very small gap between power and authority in the Cold War and a wide one today. And it has four dimensions to it. One is the sense of mutuality, that the essence of American leadership during the Cold War was the overriding sense that others, at least in the non-communist world, generally did benefit from the U.S. pursuit of its own national interest. It wasn't just that the United States claimed its hegemony to be benevolent. Many others saw it that way as well. But on too many issues, though, today, too many countries, including many allies, see their interest as hurt rather than helped by the U.S. pursuit of its own interests. The sense of mutuality is one of the things that's being questioned. And when you don't have that, you may still have power, but you have less recognition of a sense of authority. A second factor is the use of prestige as leverage. There are many stories we could recount from the Cold War where the United States just counted on its prestige in our relations with NATO and many other aspects to try to get countries to cooperate when they weren't sure they wanted to. The kinds of polls that I cited at the outset show the decline of American prestige today, and it's therefore much less leverage that can be derived from it. Third was a shared sense of legitimacy, the sense that the cause of the Cold War created a legitimacy in terms of the values that were at the core of what the West was about, that were widely shared. And again, while few people that I would give any credence to can make a case for anything particularly good about Al-Qaeda or Islamist jihadism or the like, I think there's been much more questioning of the legitimacy of the positions the United States stands for than in the previous era. And the fourth part is what I call capacity, judgment, and skill. Many people in the world felt that foreign policy was in good hands overall. Again, specific examples to the contrary during the Cold War. The great diplomats, the Kennans and the Averell Harrimans, and the people that had wide respect for their capacity, judgment, and skill. That these people were good at carrying out the objectives that they said they were pursuing. Again, I think it's fair to say that that's questioned more in today's world in terms of the power authority gap. Again, I'm going to skip over Iraq and come back to it if you like. But those are the legacies that the administration is leaving behind, that anybody, whoever the next president is on January 20, 2009, is going to have to deal with. The gap between power and influence and the gap between power and authority, which encompasses lots of issues, and of course the legacies in a variety of ways of Iraq. So if we stop and we say, okay, but more broadly, what are the global strategic challenges we face in today's world? There are four that I'd like to emphasize because they set the context for thinking about what global role the United States should play or other actors, international institutions, alliances, the European Union, other countries. One is the question of exactly what structure does this new system have? We like to do pole counting, unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. And as I said before, the world is not unipolar. I don't think it's multipolar. It's what I would call semi-hierarchical. Fuzzy concept, but if you can help me sharpen it, I'd be more than happy. But I think that part of the point is we don't get to the structure of the system simply by counting the poles. The U.S. doesn't have primacy anymore. Is it a primus inter pares, a first among equals relationship, is what we're trying to get a handle on. The role of China as a rising power. And I'll come back to this too in a second. I would argue that China is, it's not an argument, everybody knows this, that China is an increasingly powerful country in the world scene in so many respects. I would also argue, though, that in the same ways that it's impossible to have dominance by the United States, the nature of the world is such that we're not talking about a power transition, like Germany challenged Britain in 1870 to 1914, or the United States after World War II. China will be a major power, but we're not going to look at a world in which China is the single dominant power. Because we also have many more foreign policy independent states at work in today's world. Now, the 190-plus states in the world who are finally emerging on the global stage after decades, indeed centuries, of colonialism and superpower dominance are much more assertive of their own interests and identities. Take, for example, India, which many people are seeing as a rising major power, not just a regional power. It's very interesting that within the last 12 months, India has had both Putin and President Bush as visitors. India prides itself on an independent foreign policy. It will work with the United States on a certain set of issues, and it will work with others on others. And so in this effort to count polls, we have to take into account there are many more countries that can influence a whole variety of issues in the world. There's also a regionalization going on, not only in Europe, but in Asia as well, in which many of the issues of concern of security in East Asia have to do not just with U.S.-China relations, and whether the United States will stay engaged in Asia, but the tensions between China and Japan. And so we are a globalized world, but we're also becoming a regionalized world. Also in some positive ways, the efforts to work out regional security arrangements in East Asia, the African Union making efforts at it. Ultimately, I think that's where we may get to, hopefully, in the Middle East as well. The role of non-state actors, whether we consider terrorists or humanitarian NGOs, non-state actors are increasingly part of the structure of this new system. So one of the strategic challenges is figuring out exactly what the structure of the system is. Second, I want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think it would be particularly important for the kind of work you all do. It's what I call adapting traditional security doctrines and strategies. I would argue that the central security dynamic today is more about disruption and destruction than dominance. That unlike other historical eras, major states are not seeking dominance over each other. And even if they were, dominance is not possible because of the nature of the era as distinct from other eras. There are some conflicts with war potential, Russia in its near abroad, Taiwan, and others. But ours is an era that to a greater extent than any prior historical period makes integration and cooperation more in the national interest of the major powers than strict competition and even balance of power. Expanding influence, yes, but not control, back to the Thucydidean fallacy and how it applies to others as well. Now, as a caveat, anytime there's a power transition, it can be a source of instability. We can have miscalculation and all that sort of thing. There's nothing automatic about avoiding war. But the potential there, I think, is there based upon the national interest of the major powers. So whereas in some ways I would say the good news is that dominance is less of a central dynamic, disruption and destruction are. By disruption, I mean of a very high magnitude and numerous possible sources and forces. Terrorism, that in many respects, greatest threat to our societies is twofold, I think. One is catastrophic terrorism, the use of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. But the second, I think, is something that one felt obviously in London and Madrid as well as the United States and many other places, is the way that terrorism disrupts society's basic sense of security in its everyday life. And the reason we concentrate so much on terrorism, even though it's true that more people die in my country from being struck by lightning than from terrorism, is because of this fundamental sense of its disruptive effect. Weak states spilling out in regions and in other respects. To a great extent, we face threats today from the weakness, not just the strength of states. That can interact with public health, pandemics, with flows of refugees, with the spread of conflict, with havens for terrorism as well. Financial disruptions, a la 1997. Disruptions of energy supplies. Computer hackers that could shut down electric supplies or disable floodgates and hydro dams along the lines. We face some very serious threats that are more disruption than dominance. And then there's destruction, what I refer to as the multiple MDs, and I don't mean doctors. The one we're obviously most familiar with is WMD, weapons of mass destruction. But then we also are facing the threats of DMD, diseases of mass destruction. If you look at the projections on avian flu done in serious ways by public health models, the number of people that could die globally from avian flu can rival weapons of mass destruction. Or you go back to the immediate aftermath of World War I in that era and how many people died from the Spanish influenza. EMD, what one might call an environment of mass destruction, and the ways in which global climate change has some very potential destructive effects in the future, but not in all that distant a future. And then what I call IMD, or identities of mass destruction, genocides, ethnic cleansings, and the like. The ways in which we live in a world in which after the pledges at the end of World War II and the Holocaust of never again, we have had yet again and yet again and yet again. Hundreds of thousands dying in Darfur over the last few years, Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, and the like. And so I think when we think about the strategic challenges, it's a different set of kinds of threats, disruption and destruction, than strictly dominant. Which feeds into this notion that I talked about a second ago of the limited utility of classical military superiority for contemporary warfare. I say limited utility, which still means some utility. I would argue that there are many issues in the world in which one often needs a combination of the use or credible threat of force along with diplomacy in order to achieve security and other objectives. But it's limited in terms of the utility of classical military superiority. Afghanistan and Iraq, I think, are two particularly salient examples, where if one looks at the phases of major combat, October to December 2001 in Afghanistan and March to April 2003 in Iraq. And if one stopped the movie there, one would have thought in both cases that there was a substantial and sustainable military victory. But obviously in both cases, that may have been necessary but not sufficient. People have all sorts of terms. Again, Sir Rupert Smith uses the term war among the peoples. People have been analyzing the Israeli conflict in Lebanon and have been calling it hybrid warfare, asymmetric warfare, what I would say is fully political warfare, taking Clausewitz to the nth degree about wars, politics by other means. But as we think about this dynamic, it's a very different kind of challenge for all of us. How do we adapt security doctrines? In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the U.S. National Security Strategy 2002 said deterrence is irrelevant to the threats we face. Well, fortunately, we've been stepping back from that a little bit and changing the question, or changing the mode of analysis. Obviously, we can't think of deterrence the way we did against the Warsaw Pact forces on the plains of Germany, or even the strategic nuclear equation. But how can one think about the possibilities? How does one need to deter? Because we have to have, in this era, I believe we have to have doctrines of national defense that deal with the new threats we face, with doctrines of deterrence. Deterrence may not be as central as it was in the Cold War, but it's a crucial element. Deal with these notions of hybrid warfare. And even in the transition that we've seen over the last 15 years from peacekeeping to peace building and state building. It's worth remembering that in 1988, the United Nations peacekeeping forces won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, for all of the successes it had in the 1980s. Those were the old model. Two parties to a conflict reach a point where they want to end the conflict. They need a third party to provide reassurance. Iran and Iraq in 1988, the conflict in El Salvador, the conflict in Cambodia. Many of the issues we've had that we still sometimes refer to as peacekeeping really are much more peace building or peace operations or state building, where we're dealing with situations in which the parties have not decided that they want to end their conflict, and we try to figure out how third-party forces, be it NATO or the UN or the African Union or others, and we're looking for new doctrines, many of which have these issues of how you balance force and diplomacy. And then in a very broad sense, beyond the military and even the diplomatic, is do we need to start developing doctrines of prevention? How often do we talk about needing to get to the roots of the conflict? If we really want to fully deal with jihadism and terrorism, we need to not only deal with the cells and the operators, but get to the roots, or failed states and the security consequences they can have. That requires long-term strategies that might be analogous to preventive medicine and that are very difficult to develop for any number of reasons, including what economists say, the discounting of the future. But they need to be another area in which we think about developing security doctrines broadly conceived. I'm going to go over this really quickly, but two other forces, I think, is the broad context of globalization and global governance. That the strategic dimensions of globalization and what I call the high-speed connectedness has a huge impact upon how we think about security problems. And I emphasize the high speed. If you're a decision maker in London or Brussels or Washington, or you're commanding forces in theater, and you know that there's been a certain incident that happened, and your time in which to make a decision is in part affected by the fact that that's probably already on Al Jazeera, or on a blog, or on BBC, or on CNN. It makes the kinds of decisions we have to make qualitatively different than if you even said, I have 36 hours to do it. We used to think about the button during the Cold War, and what was the decision time an American president might have. This in many ways may even be shorter. So there are many aspects to globalization that add to this. Just let me mention one other, which is this problem, as I said, of weak states. At the end of the 1990s, and I'll be critical of an administration that I was a part of, there was something in the Clinton administration we used to say, look, there's three types of countries in the world. There's type A, type B, and type C, when you think strategically. Type A are the big countries. Russia, China, Europe. Those are big strategic issues for us. Type B were sort of the medium-sized, the Persian Gulf countries and the North Korea. We have to think about those. But all those little Type C countries, you don't really have to worry about them as importantly strategically. A country like Afghanistan. Soviets were out. It's a Type C country. Well, on 9/11, we found out that Type C countries could have Type A effects. And so one of the dilemmas of thinking about weak states is exactly which ones can we afford to ignore. Even leaving aside questions of ethics and social justice, but as a security question. The other factor, I think, shaping the world is this notion of the politics of identity. That identity, more than ideology, is a defining force in today's world. whether it's the West and Islam, or Shiite and Sunni among Islam, or various other ethnic conflicts and genocides. And part of the strategic challenge is thinking about what kinds of doctrines and strategies deal with conflicts and threats that are fueled by identity, not just by ideology. That's the context, as I said, for all, I would argue, for lots of strategic thinking. But to get to America's own role in this, and flowing out of this are a number of parameters and then some priority areas. I think the overarching goal the United States has right now is rebuilding trust and confidence. And this is not just people liking the United States again. This is a fundamentally strategic issue when you send your Secretary of State to a capital to try to get cooperation. The questions, the earlier points about mutuality, capacity, and legitimacy can have profound effects, whether it's within their own domestic politics or their own strategic calculation of whether or not they'll work with the United States. And that trust and confidence has to be rebuilt if people are going to believe that American leadership can be in their interest, not just in our interest. Leadership styles, again, are going to take a combination of things. Leading. I would argue that American power can be in the global interest. It has been in the past, it still is in some respects, and I think it can be even more. Not a unipolar world, but there are areas in which I think the United States leadership will continue to be crucial, not just to us, but to making things happen in the world. Collaboration, the importance of alliances and partners. Afghanistan, I think, is a good example now where ultimately I think the fate of the strategy is an intra-NATO issue, particularly. To empower, to work with and through international institutions. The UN is not the solution to all problems, far from it. But the UN is least effective when either the United States just doesn't work with it or opposes it. And in fact has been the most effective when we have tried to work through it, as we did in 1990-91 in the response to the invasion of Kuwait. And sometimes leadership means deferring. Let others take the lead. There are aspects of East Asian security right now, I think, that would serve the United States and Europe's interests, but they really need to be worked out among the Asian countries. That's not a withdrawal of the United States from Asia, but it is saying there's some aspects where deferring to others will be important. Points I've made before, that the importance of a balanced strategy. And that goes, I've been critical of the limits of the utility of military force, but it also goes for diplomacy. It's not enough to talk about diplomacy as well, let's just talk about it. Sometimes diplomacy at the UN and elsewhere confuses conflict avoidance with security enhancement. And ultimately diplomacy has to try to solve problems, not just put off the possibility of the use of force. Military power is still crucial to America's global role. We need to strengthen other tools of the trade. And we also need to break out of two problems, which is the tunnel vision problem, and understand the breadth of the agenda. We can't do everything, but sometimes we just let one issue dominate the agenda too much. And the myopia problem of short-term fixes that create long-term problems, like, for example, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. 5 areas that I stress, and I'm only going to focus on a couple of these, that I think are important roles for the United States to play. To be a security enhancer, to be the fulcrum rather than the foil of multilateralism, to do more to support what's called the human security agenda, to focus on global climate change, and frankly to revitalize the domestic foundations of our own strength in foreign policy. In the Cold War, again, speaking very broadly and generally, the United States basically functioned as a security provider. It's not that others didn't contribute to Western security, but basically, in terms of the distribution of the burdens and the lead roles, we can look at the Cold Era as the general pattern was we were a provider of security. Even in perfect policies, again, that doesn't fit the nature of the era we're in. The goal, I think, is to try to be a security enhancer, to help allies in global order with crucial margins of security, in addition to what they do for themselves and through other relationships, directly and indirectly. This was the role I think we played in some of the post-Cold War successes, Bosnia, Kosovo. We didn't do those on our own, but I think we provided crucial margins. And it's also what we did not do in some of the major failures like Rwanda. There is an argument to be made in the Bush era that some people make of whether or not we've been a security detractor. Iraq is a big part of that. There's even what Secretary Rumsfeld used to call the terrorism metric, in which he said, every day I wake up and I ask myself, have we killed, captured, deterred more terrorists than the mullahs and others have created? And I think that while one should definitely put some things in the positive column, I think in many respects the terrorism metric has come out net negative and is part of the question of whether or not the United States has been a security detractor. The areas in which I think it's most important that we play the security enhancer role, again, Iraq being one, I think countering terrorism is absolutely crucial. You know, you read the first pages of the Al-Qaeda manual, and whatever else one might talk about that need to be parts of the strategy to deal with the political dimensions, the economic dimensions, the cultural dimensions. It is the case that Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups really are pursuing destruction and killing. I call it statistics versus Shakespeare because it's the statistic on getting hit by lightning versus Shakespeare's notion that all the world's a stage, which is exactly what terrorist groups understand. Terrorism, while having its national and regional aspects, is a shared security threat and continues to have the potential to bring together countries to work together with a shared security threat. And it has to be a multifaceted strategy in a number of areas. I think another area that's priority is this where peace brokering and non-proliferation come together. If you look just at the Middle East, and here I include Iran particularly, and North Korea, the U.S. role is not singular. In North Korea, there's the six-party talks. With Iran, there are the EU3 and others. But I think the U.S. role is crucial. It's particularly crucial in both of these. Professor Bowen and I have both studied the Libya case and see that one of the crucial things in getting Libya, which very few people predicted would happen, to give up its WMD and get out of the terrorism business, was the reassurances that this was about policy change and not regime change. That there was a security assurance, particularly from the United States, because that was the one most relevant to the Libyans, that was the goal. And both in Iran and North Korea, that is a crucial role that only the United States can play. And the questions of proliferation in many ways relate to the broader issues of trying to broker peace in the regions. The Arab-Israeli peace is a part of this as well, but I think that in some respects, the whole relationship with Iran, while critically working on the nuclear issue, and I've just written a paper on this that will be published this week on the sanctions piece of that, but one has to think about peace brokering and non-proliferation together. Asian regional security, I've made a couple of comments about, is a priority area. I view it as one of the regions of the world that has the most risks of conflict, whether it's Taiwan or China-Japan or other sorts of issues. And I would argue that the question of genocide and IMD prevention. To be perfectly frank, there's no oil. Well, there is oil in Darfur. I guess that's what's important to the Chinese and others. But, if we are ever going to talk about something called the international community, I think it's very hard in a fundamental ethical way to do it unless we can get this fairly basic issue better, which is the question of man's inhumanity to man and these profound killings. And in many of these conflicts, the kinds of strategies that are available to deal with them are fairly doable in the levels of troops, and particularly if you intervene before it gets too late. But I would say that's a priority area in which there needs to be more leadership. Fulcrum not to foil multilateralism. Most people would sort of say that I understand why we should work multilaterally in this world. My question is it doable? And those are very valid questions. And many people that defend international institutions have to talk about not just why we desire them, but how to make them doable. Part of multilateralism, I think, is what I was referring to earlier, is this notion of major power geopolitics. How to bring in Russia and India and China into a global system that still needs to integrate them and bring them in rather than keeping them down. Expansion of the Security Council. Working with China on what the Deputy Secretary of State called being a responsible stakeholder. I think that if you want to set up multilateralism, you have to start with the relationship between the major powers and trying to find the areas where they can cooperate. I often talk about tough love multilateralism with the UN, which is that people that really believe in it should be the first ones to criticize it and say it's not all about John Bolton and George Bush. The UN has many problems that it needs to address on its own. It has problems of efficacy of a variety of effects. Human security agenda, I'm going to skip over because I'm watching the clock. But I think that there are major issues there that, again, can lead to failed states, which in turn create security problems, and that present fundamental problems for the global community about the Millennium Development Goals, which the UN established, which I'd actually like to see the United States, rather than being the major critic of them, to try to embrace them and try to improve upon them and mobilize efforts to try to bring them together. I think that's a fundamental part of a security agenda. Global climate change, I think, is extremely important, and it expands our agenda. There is a security dimension to this, but it's a bit of a stretch. But I think that this is what I sort of refer to as a master key issue. That you can talk about this issue, and here I'm actually thinking politically if one is trying to convince the American public about these things, and through that issue, a little bit like what William Blake's old, the grain of sand through which you see the world, you can get a sense about what our energy security problems are. how it does relate to terrorism, how it relates to geopolitics, how it relates to the economy, and how it frankly relates to what we may leave for posterity. This could play to many American strengths: technology innovation, our ability to mobilize ourselves for major projects. And so I'd really like to see us become the leader and not the laggard as we head to Kyoto 2. Lastly, it's really our business, but it affects the rest of the world too, is we really need to revitalize the domestic foundation of American foreign policy. Our role in the world has been best when it's been based on a secure and competitive economy. And we spend a lot of time in thinking about the problems we have in international economic competitiveness, worrying about what China's doing, what India's doing. You may remember in the Olympics, a few Olympics back, there was a skater named Tanya Harding. And her rival was an American named Nancy Kerrigan. And Tanya Harding figured she couldn't beat her, so she tried to break her kneecaps. I don't think we should go around trying to break China and India's kneecaps. I think you need to do what other Olympic athletes do, is make yourself the most competitive possible. That relates to our domestic policies on technology, the deficits we've been running, and the like. 2 points that I'll end on. One is a question of how much of a model is American democracy. And here I'll just tell a brief story. In September 2005, a month after the Hurricane Katrina, I was in South Asia with a number of Indian and Pakistani diplomats, scholars, generals, and the like. And a very distinguished Indian general, whose name you would know if I mentioned it, just said to me privately one night, he said, I'm a friend of the United States. He says, I really believe you're an important part of the world. But what do I tell my people about Hurricane Katrina? The most basic function of government is to provide for people in the face of a natural disaster. And I don't really care whether it's George Bush's fault, the governor's fault, the mayor's fault. The bottom line is you weren't able to fulfill that. And so if you want to be a model, how you run your country at home really matters. And he said it in not a bashing way, but in a friendly way. And the last point, I think, is my concerns about the American military, both its force levels after Iraq, recruiting quality, and its morale. For the price the American military has paid, with extraordinary bravery, as has the British military and many other militaries, I think we are unfortunately, a lot of the rebuilding the military we did over many, many years after Vietnam is something we're now going to have to readdress. So let me stop there. I apologize for going a little bit longer than I'd like, but happy to entertain comments, questions, or whatever.
Professor Jentleson was asked the following 7 questions. Question 1. With regard to America's position in the world, do you see the next president following a traditional straight-line agenda, or do you see another dramatic shift, like we've seen with the Bush administration?
I think that 2 things. One is the discussion in the campaign will not be particularly profound. I've worked on every presidential campaign on the Democratic side since 1988, including in 2000 when I was Vice President Gore's senior foreign policy advisor. And so you can predict what's going to happen. In fact, one of the joys of being here in the UK for the next 6 months is being away from a daily diet of that. I still get some, but a daily diet. I think we're in a period now that's a lot like the period after World War II. That's why I tried to frame these global strategic challenges. We really need some conceptual thinking. There's a mix of continuity and change, whether it's about what U.S. stands for or about what's going on in the world. I tried to highlight some of the changes there, but there's elements of continuity there too. And so the exciting part, like it was for Bernard Brodie and others who were there, or Dean Acheson, as he said, present at the creation, is very much that we're in an era that has those opportunities. I think that the United States needs to focus on not only the realities of dealing with some of these things that are the Bush legacy, like a huge budget deficit, probably a continued presence in Iraq, but also these questions about, the forces that were changing the world even if there had not been a Bush administration. So I don't think that's a left turn, if this was a right turn, a sharp 90-degree turn. But I do think that core things that we stand for, or that we should stand for, I think will be the same, which will be the sense of a strongly internationalist foreign policy, one in which we try again to develop that mutuality, in which our pursuit, which is even why I mentioned things like genocide prevention, that there is this sense of mutuality, and that we do play a lead role, but it won't be a Cold War role, or it won't be unipolarity, because the structures of the system, let's say if you think of 5 major powers, right, the EU, the United States, Russia, China, and Japan, and maybe India, still think we will be the most powerful among those. And, believe me, there are people that say, America's global role, thank you very much, we'd rather have none. But anyway, when you press them on things like, well, how are you, you get some differences there. So I think that it's a good time to have some new conceptual frameworks that integrate this notion of continuity and change.
Question 2. Do you see problems with statesmanship now as endemic, as ones that are structurally problematic in the US system? Or is this a subject you can see being turned around quickly?
Yeah, that's a good question. It has a lot of elements to it. One is, I mentioned the Libya case, which I said Professor Bowen's written on, and I've written on as well. And one of the things when you study that case, the secret talks that were going on that actually, the UK started and the United States joined in the late Clinton administration, what you see there is a really interesting story of diplomacy. They had a strategy. It wasn't just talking, but it was a question of if Libya does X, what do they get for it? On the way to settling the Lockerbie case and on the way to settling the WMD case. And how do you do not giving them too little for too much, and how do you avoid giving them too much for too little, right? And I came out of that another thing saying that we actually need to be doing things like I think you're doing here, more on the defense side. The militaries, to their credit, here and elsewhere in the United States, game things out, look at things left, right, and sideways. I think we tend to treat diplomacy as more still about, frankly, about, what side do you put the China on? And I mean the China on the table, And so if you imagine starting to think about, thinking through strategies of diplomacy, work like people Thomas Schelling did many years ago. So number one, I think that's doable. I think we need to put resources behind it. We have a Foreign Service Institute as well as our National Defense University that at both, I think what's going on at the Foreign Service Institute is light years behind what's going on there. So, that's doable, number one. The second part that's interesting, though, is when you think about careers. I have a lot of students, both graduate students and undergraduates. And I tell them when I graduated college as an undergraduate in the early 1970s, interested in international affairs, it was a difficult time, it was the Vietnam period. I had a couple basic choices. One, I could join the Peace Corps. The other, I could go get a PhD. Or I could join the Foreign Service. I actually did none of them. I came to Europe, bought a van in Brussels, and traveled for a year, but that's another story. I eventually went back to get my doctorate. My students today and your students today can join NGOs, and many of my students will tell me, even though it's not just the private sector salaries, NGOs don't pay any much more than government work does, but they often say to me, I feel like I can make a difference more. And so we're competing for our best and the brightest in the youth against many other international actors. That's not necessarily bad, because NGOs also are an important part of the mix, but if we're thinking about the Foreign Service and the State Department, we have to get more competitive for young people that want to be involved in these things. And so that is a little bit of a structural problem, but again, you could find ways to address those kinds of things. In the same way we've addressed how do we recruit more for our militaries, benefits, incentives, it seems to me we could do that on the diplomacy side too.
Question 3. Do you think that over the last few years, America has become increasingly focused on its hard power options and has neglected its soft power? And do you think that this is because soft power lacks a degree of precision and measurability, whereas hard power can be articulated far more easily in terms of troop numbers, missiles, warheads, etc.? And do you think that has been detrimental and one of the reasons for the problems that America is facing?
Yes, it is. And the political consultants say that, the Republicans are the daddy party and the Democrats are the mommy party, with no offense to our female colleagues. But that's the way they put it in stereotypes. To which I say, Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, some pretty tough female leaders out there historically. But I think there's a little bit of a paradox there, which is that we have had an administration that came into power. If you go back and you read the article in the Foreign Affairs, January, February 2000, that Condoleezza Rice wrote when she was advisor to Governor Bush on what their foreign policy would be. Her basic argument was, we understand power and the Democrats don't. Clinton did not. So we've actually had an administration that did it, and people are now saying to themselves, did that give me more security? I think now there's more questioning of the notion of just blank check on hard power. Hard power is the answer to every problem, right? And so you set the stage, and there's things in between hard and soft power. Professor Nye is visiting Oxford. We're having lunch on Friday. These great opportunities to talk to my American colleagues that I sometimes don't see in the States here in the UK. And Joe's notion has really caught on with soft power, but it means so many things, right? So when I talked about power as control over resources, distinguished from persuading others to do what you want them to do or controlling outcomes, I didn't just mean soft power the way Joe talks about it, of persuasion. There are many aspects to that. So if we think of this as a continuum, and at one end is the hardest form of power, and at the other end is the softest, it's interesting to think about what falls in between. It's still very hard to be precise about it. But I actually think in our political debate, Democrats still have to make the case that they understand the utility of force and hard power, that it's not always a bad thing. And they have to make that case, not just rhetorically, but, I think some of the arguments that myself and others are trying to make is trying to balance the two. But in the studies I've done about force and diplomacy, you increasingly find, particularly in the contemporary era, very few cases in which military force is sufficient to achieve an objective. And very few cases, I think, in which, if it's a very difficult or conflictual objective, diplomacy on its own is. Even the Libya case, there was this backdrop, of the possibility of the use of military force. It wasn't as big a factor as Dick Cheney made it out to be. And in the Iran case, I think we have very limited military options. But there are other forms of hard power there, regional security arrangements, the meeting with the Sunni leaders and trying to say that there's a regional security interest. I would call that a form of hard power, too. And moreover, I would argue that they're not necessarily sequential, but you need to find ways in which they are synergistic, which I think changes some of the traditional approaches. So yeah, I think that it's important, but I think I don't think Americans are ready to have somebody say, my version of America's role in the world is going to be all about 30% increase in expenditure on the military, using force whenever we can. I think we said, we just tried that, and we're not sure it worked. We're more than not sure it worked.
Question 4. The executive arm of the US government may have similar views to those you have expressed, but after 8 years of failed foreign policy, is Congress going to support the executive or constrain them, saying, we've had enough of all this, we've got a budget deficit to worry about, and this has got to drive the next 4 years?
Absolutely. I think that we'll be constrained. I think the budget deficit, we worked very hard in the 1990s to do what people said we couldn't do, which was to get a surplus. They decided that, if you have a surplus, you'll spend it, so we'll get rid of it. Who's financing most of our debt now? You talk about leverage in international relations? China's central banks, right? Everybody says, well, they have an interest in currency values and stuff. But imagine if there's a crisis over Taiwan. Who has leverage over whom? And that's why I talk about vulnerabilities at home that are self-induced. So yeah, there will be constraints, but not everything that we're talking about here necessarily costs large chunks of new money, which is why when you talk about leadership, it's lead, collaborate, leverage, defer. Not everything has to talk about huge amounts of new money, number one. Number two is if somebody comes in, you usually do get a honeymoon. And if you can demonstrate that what you're having, you're not going to get automatic results right away, but it's headed in the right direction. You got the arrow headed in the right direction. Congress has a habit that my colleagues who study Congress call credit claiming and blame avoidance. So what's happening in Congress now in Iraq is everybody's stepping right up to the edge, but you will not see them take responsibility for fundamentally changing policy unless it gets really, really worse, because they do blame avoidance. They can't figure out how to credit claim either, and that's sort of the dilemma they have in this situation now. Congress is tough, and it has vested interest. Climate change, I've been struck in the 1 month I've been here, just outside of groups like this, just the common discourse on global environmental issues, just picking up the newspaper and reading, seeing that Tesco is saying that it's going carbon neutral on its products in its supermarkets. Well, that must mean that they think that matters to the everyday British shopper. The discourse here on the global environment is about how to solve it. The discourse back in the U.S. still is about, is it a problem? But I can tell you, I know this for a fact, and I know this from some contact I still with Vice President Gore, is the business community is really changing. The business community now is saying, look, we used to say we hate all environmental policies. Now we're willing to differentiate between smart ones and not smart ones, because the dichotomy of what's good for the environment is bad for business has been broken at. There are things to work with. I think one of the things you need to do is not say we want to do this all right away, but you need to frankly have a conceptual structure which we might call in academic circles a paradigm and communicators call a frame. People are what psychologists call cognitive misers on international issues. It's like, I don't want to think that much about it. I don't need to know your position on every issue. But if I believe that the few things I know about what do you see as shaping the world, what's America's role, what are your priorities, that's enough for me to say you got my confidence. And public opinion polls continue to be over 60% for notions of internationalism. People are not into retreat.
Question 5. You mentioned the domestication of foreign policy. Do you think this is likely to challenge America's ability to project its identity, which in turn might generate problems?
One of the fascinating things about the world today is that there are very few societies that are homogeneous anymore. Maybe Japan, maybe Korea. None of the Middle East is, right? You have Palestinian workers everywhere, and now you've had these huge Iraqi refugee flows to Jordan and elsewhere. And in Europe, obviously. The heterogeneity of societies here, both in terms of percentages and types of heterogeneity, is vastly different than 30 years ago when I was here as a graduate student. I would actually take you back further. I think our fundamental problem remains race. You know, there's some progress, and it's great that we have some very prominent African-American leaders, even in Sunday's Super Bowl. The two coaches are both African-American. You know, so that's significant, as well as Condi Rice, Colin Powell, etc. So the challenge for us, actually, is to go back to one of the things that people believed was great about America, which was, can we demonstrate how heterogeneous societies can live in reasonable societal harmony? I don't see the Hispanic population as necessarily a huge problem. It actually tends to be a very conservative population. It tends to want its children to do well. It's very Catholic, religiously. And so even the question of the use of the Spanish language, you know, people know that their kids need to speak English to get ahead, but I don't feel, again, in this environment where people speak so many languages in Europe, I think that's been overblown a lot. So I actually think we have some very serious problems. We made a lot of progress in the 50s, and I think since then we actually have made some, but not enough. And so one of our challenges that I do write about when I get more into it is to demonstrate that as a society we have the social mobility we brag about. Even interesting, David Brooks, who's a conservative columnist for the New York Times, wrote a column a while ago that said, you know, and he's usually critical of Europe, as you probably tell. He said, gosh, I can't believe it. I've been looking at all these studies lately, and social mobility in the United States is actually lower now than Europe. He says, that's what we always assumed, that we were ahead. He then goes on to give a prescription which is about more strengthening the family and not doing social policies. But that's a very interesting statistic, that whatever Europe's problems are, our actual social mobility is now less than it is here. So we do need to address those issues.
Question 6. Do you think something can be done before Bush goes? And if so, what sort of activities can we expect?
I don't think Iraq is sustainable. I don't know how you sustain it. The vote in the 2006 election was really quite extraordinary, that the public, in a fairly pragmatic way, said, you know, the president was giving speeches up to the eve of the election, you're either with the terrorists or you're with America. He would say we need to win, and most people would agree with that in principle. But when he would say things like we're winning, I actually think a lot of average Americans said, if he thinks we're winning, I find that frightening. So I don't know how we sustain it. I think the Iraq Study Group, its report wasn't perfect, but its goal was to give the president something that was a bridge to try to say, let's try to work with this, and let's find some bipartisanship from lots of prominent people. And he just said no. And I have some good friends that, that are still good friends that are in the administration and stuff, and there's a bit of a bunker mentality that I find frightening. So I don't know how you sustain this. I don't know how we, by the end of 2007, continue with the strategy that's on the table right now. My fear is that what you end up with is the worst of all worlds, which is a non-strategy, which is just withdrawal, because you can't sustain it. And then many of the fears that people have, may well come true. But it won't be because we should have stayed in. It'll be because we didn't make a serious effort in the time that we sort of had to try to develop an alternative strategy.
Question 7. Why don't you want to be just one of the major powers? And why struggle to define a uniqueness?
We have, in our history, we have either been reasonably isolationist in the 19th century, with the exception of the Western Hemisphere, a rising power against a European, multipolar balanced power world in the early part of the 20th century. The single dominant power, or one of the two superpowers from 1945 to the end of the Cold War. In the 1990s, this brief moment. I mean, Krauthammer was right. There was a unipolar moment. It just was a moment, not an era. He was wrong about that. And now you're right. This is a different situation, and to figure out what role to play. We are not automatically dominant. But I think my notion, the primus inter pares notion, first among equals, is a little bit looking at what the structure is. I mean, the structure of the world, I think, still has a role for the United States to play, that even if we talked about 5 major powers, 2020, 2020, I'd still say we would be at 25 or 30 of that 100%. And again, there's other things going on. My view is it's what's in the U.S. national interest and in the interest of the broader goals of international peace, security, and justice. And I think, there are problems in doing that. There's no question about it. But, the goal, I think, is to try to, just like at the end of 1945, people weren't really sure where we were going to go. What was this thing called strategic deterrence? How did you think about nuclear weapons? And it took a lot of thinking at all sorts of levels to try to figure out, what the overarching strategies would be. And we're in a very difficult period like that. This is some ideas to throw into the mix. But I think it's crucial that we that we sort that out. Retreat is not an option. It's not an option for us, and I don't think with push comes to shove that most of the world wants that to happen. So you're right. What in between unipolarity and retreat, or straight multipolarity, what is it? Well, it's sort of like soft power. There was a Supreme Court justice who, Potter Stewart, had once said, when it was an obscenity case, he said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. That's a cop-out, but I think I'll know what this role is when I see it, but we still need some concept that kind of puts some parameters around.
Professor Jentleson can be contacted by email at bruce.jentleson, spelt Juliet Echo November Tango Lima Echo Sierra Oscar November, at politics.ox.ac.uk.